Thank you all for coming out here tonight on this beautiful day. Really lovely to share space with you all. My name is Julia. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm on the events team here. Before we get started, I do just want to share a few quick logistics. First of all, if you want, there are a few more seats in the front, so feel free to make your way and get comfy. We are going to ask that you keep your mask on throughout the event tonight. And we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so please start thinking of questions and then hang on to them. At the end of the talk tonight, Tsering is going to be signing and personalizing books at that desk over there where you all checked in. And if you're joining us virtually on YouTube, of which I saw there are quite a few of you already, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies online, and you can use the link in the live stream description to do so. Okay, with all the logistics out of the way, I'm so very excited tonight to be introducing Tsering Yangzom Lama and Neugeboren, who are here tonight celebrating the release of Tsering's new book, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. A bit about the book for those who may not know much yet. This book is an intergenerational story that spans both decades and continents. We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies opens just after China's invasion of Tibet in 1959 as two sisters arrive at a refugee camp in Nepal, and the story threads pick up again years later when one sister is now living in Toronto. Connected both by family and by a statue of a nameless saint, the sisters' story beautifully explores themes of displacement, connection, and homeland. This truly gorgeously written debut sheds a light on the experience of Tibetan exiles and is a story that I'm sure is going to move every reader. We're so very honored to be able to celebrate it with you all here tonight. Tsering Yangzom Lama was born and raised in Nepal, where her family settled after fleeing Tibet in the early 1960s. She has since lived in Vancouver, Toronto, and New York City. She received a BA in Creative Writing and International Relations from the University of British Columbia and an MFA from Columbia University. Her writing has been awarded by the Canada Council for the Arts, Hedgebrook, Tin House, Art Omi, the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, and many others. She is a lifelong activist and serves as a storytelling advisor for Greenpeace International. And as I mentioned, Tsering is joined in conversation tonight by Neugeboren. Jay is the author of 22 books, including 5 prize-winning novels, 2 prize-winning books of nonfiction, and 4 collections of award-winning stories, a few of which are available for purchase at the desk. His stories and essays have appeared in many publications, including the New York Review of Books, the Atlantic Monthly, Plowshares, GQ, and the New York Times, among others, and have been reprinted in more than 50 anthologies. He now lives and writes in New York City, where he teaches in the graduate writing program of the Columbia University School of the Arts. So with all of that out of the way, let's give these two a really big round of applause.
So I'm going to ask Tsering to read a short section from her novel first, please.
Before I begin, I just want to say thank you so much to Jay for being here. It's a real honor. After so many years, so when you were my mentor, I really, really appreciate your support. And also just to all the Tibetans here, in particular, and hello to everyone else as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Can you speak up a little bit? Sorry?
Sure, yes. So I'm just going to read the first page of my novel to give you a sense of the story. This is in Hamo's perspective. She's a preteen who's just escaped and is in the border of Nepal and Western Tibet in spring 1960. Amma was an oracle. The realization came to my mother late in life, when her monthly bleeding stopped and something else opened inside. Some in our village called it an affliction. They said there was a crack in her mind, and that left her open to spirits who would consume her. But Amma insisted that it was a blessing to lend her body to the gods and let them speak through her. In time, everyone would listen to her, and the words of an otherwise ordinary woman would lead us through the coming troubles. It wasn't just my mother who had changed. Packs of wolves and rats swept through our valley. Next, there was an earthquake that tore a jagged line through the village monastery. Then, just as I was learning to speak, there came news that invaders had crossed our eastern border, entering our land as two enormous snakes. In the distant town of Kadze, people watched them cross the river in long lines and burrow into the highlands. They wished to be called the People's Liberation Army, but we knew them as the Gyami, a people from the lowlands to the east. In the years that followed, rumors came like crows, even traveling as far west as our village. Although I was just a young girl, many of the rumors landed in my ears before anyone else in my family. My source was Laksam, my oldest friend. He worked as a servant to a traveling merchant who traded in gossip as much as iron pots and pans. In our free moments, Laksam and I wandered in the pastures with my little sister, Tenki, hanging on my back or flopping around in the grass. In those hills, Laksam told me the most shocking stories. Gyami soldiers had seized farmland in the east, and many of our people were now starving. No grain, no salt, no meat or even butter. I walked around in a daze after hearing this, unable to imagine life without butter. Laksam said that although it was quiet in our region, a resistance raged in the east, in places where iron birds circled the skies, and bullets, big and small, rained down on entire towns, smashing bodies as if they were nothing but effigies made of dough, where rooftops were torn apart and no one could tell whether they had found the remains of a loved one or that of a stranger. But I did not tell my family these things. I never repeated them to anyone.
Thank you. I'd like to begin our conversation by reading a comment I made about the book in the current issue of Plowshares magazine. This wildly beautiful novel, epic in scale, moves back and forth in time and across continents as it traces 3 generations of a Tibetan family and tells the story of their lives as exiles. The narrative, which begins with China's 1959 invasion of Tibet, is gorgeously structured. The story told with tenderness and with a restrained but felt passion that makes the lives of its characters, their individuality, as well as the cultural, historical, and familial bonds that shape their destinies, palpable. This is a magnificently textured and deeply affecting novel, and I'll stand by that. I was thrilled when I received an advanced copy of Tsering's novel and recalled, not perfectly, when we had worked on the beginnings of it 10 years ago when I was faculty at Columbia and Tsering was a grad student. When this book was, I would say, maybe a twinkle in her eye. So, but it took her almost 10 years to bring it to fruition. And so I'd like to begin the question is, you have created a very rich, textured, complex book over a long period of time. So could you tell us what that process was like in 25 words or less? No. But what was it like from I think people are always curious about where do people often ask me, where do you book all these novels and stories come from? And I say, well, when they're on sale at Costco, that's where I get them. But really, it is, for me, to some degree, a mystery, where some of my books have come from, not all of them. In this case, I don't think it's a mystery where the essence of the tale, really an epic story, has come from. But maybe you could tell us a little bit of where it came from, what attracted your interest and said, I'm going to write about this, and how through the years it developed.
Sure, yeah, thank you for the question. So initially, I think I was, so just kind of tracking back to the story of my family and I guess the broader Tibetan exile experience right now. You know, my grandparents were nomads in Western Tibet, and this is the way that they had lived for many, many generations, you know, from time immemorial, probably, you know. And then they were forced to flee when the invaders came, and it was very, very difficult to survive in Tibet. And then my parents were literally penniless refugees, you know, begging on the side of streets to eat. And I lived in Nepal, and I also lived in the West, and I was at Columbia and trying to think about what I wanted to write. And I was struck by just this immense shift in our way of living across 3 generations, but really across just a few decades. When you think about this like ancient tradition of nomadicism to now living in the West, and I think there was a real shift in the way we live, but also for me it was a moral disorientation, I would say. Like, how is it possible that all of this happened, and how did we survive, and how is it, yes?
But you were born in Nepal,
Yes.
so you did not experience the culture, let's say, of your family that had come from Tibet. So what was it about that intrigued you?
Yeah, well, I mean, living in Nepal, I would say, I lived pretty closely in the Tibetan refugee enclave in Nepal. And I was always obsessed with novels and short stories and things like that, books, you know, I read everything I could. But in Nepal, books are quite expensive, and you know, it's 300-400 rupees for a single book, and most people earn 3,000-4,000 rupees a month. So it's an extreme privilege to be able to pick a book and buy it and take it home and to read it. And I had that privilege, but also I recognized that all of the books that I was reading, they came from cultural production in the West. And there was almost nobody no Tibetans are on the TVs or in the newspapers, and so we're, you know, effectively invisible.
Why were you given, I'll call it a gift, of growing up with books? How did that happen in your family?
Right, so my father was really, he loved books, and he had up to grade 8 education, and my mother had up to grade 3 education. So you can imagine like how rare that was to even love books, and our bookshelves were full of Tolstoy and, you know, like all kinds of books that he loved, and, you know, just self-taught. But actually a lot of Tibetans, this is not, I don't want to, you know, sort of reify or, you know, my family specifically, but a lot of Tibetans in Nepal are multilingual. Even if, you know, they are refugees and never went to formal schools, they speak 4 to 6 languages. And that's been necessary for us to survive in a world in which we're stateless and have no papers and no citizenship. And so just by the brilliance and the entrepreneurial spirit of Tibetan people as refugees, most people are very, very interested in like other cultures, I guess I would say. So like I would, you know, outside my home, I would watch Hindi movies, so in Indian culture. And then in my school, I spoke Nepali, and then at home, I spoke Tibetan, and then eventually I went to American school, I spoke English. So I sort of had this understanding of like...
And were you, in those years, were you growing up, you were stateless,
Yes.
obviously, but you were in a refugee camp in a city? What was the nature? Because the book, as I don't know how many of you have read it yet, you're in for a great treat. And you mentioned Tolstoy, which I didn't want to make you, embarrass you, but it was when I've talked to friends about the book. It is the author that comes most to mind, because it traverses a period of history and gives us the personal stories, but also the historical moment that is occurring while the family is going through the 3 generations, its own struggles. But in your life as a child, what was your physical condition in terms of schools? In a refugee camp, in a neighboring city, where?
So I was born just after my parents left the refugee camp that they met and fell in love in, and which I sort of basically lose the story in. So I grew up in Kathmandu, in the capital, in a private home outside of sort of the structure of like this intimate refugee settlement, which still exists. And so I had that privilege that was really just a few years difference from my siblings, my older siblings, who didn't have all of the benefit of the education that I had. So my personal history is one aspect, but I think a really important aspect for my sort of inspiration for this book was my study of my culture. The things that I was cut off from because of colonization and exile and displacement. I could not physically go to Tibet as a Tibetan, and that's the case for a lot of Tibetans in exile right now. It's very, very hard to get a visa. I was just speaking to a friend who hasn't seen his family in 22 years after leaving Tibet, because he can't, go back easily. And so writing a historical novel in that state, I had to really rely on all kinds of other sources, including oral tradition and scholarship. And as I started to do that research, I became deeply in love with my culture, the things that I was cut off from. I was like, this is fascinating. Actually, this is really, really interesting.
Wow.
And I drew on that to actually structure my book, these traditions, like the Terma tradition, which is a treasure text tradition, these texts that are hidden all across Tibet, as physical texts, as mind texts, 1,200 years ago, that are meant to be revealed in the fates of future practitioners in Tibet, to help them, to guide them, to give them teachings, and that are still believed to be hidden all over Tibet. I thought that was a staggeringly beautiful idea. This kind of long, huge scale, this vastness of connection with the land. And so I use these ideas, for instance, with the gu, the statue that appears and disappears.
Yes.
That gu is a terma text in my mind. It's a similar
Yes.
kind of idea. So some of these cultural things, I made them into narrative tools.
But of course, the great subject that permeates the book is the great feeling, for me anyway, is a feeling of loss. And what do you do when what you've lost cannot be recaptured? And what does that do to you, to those people you love or want to love, in your own life, if you cannot connect? And I want to connect this to something else, which is the presence in the book of your descriptions of the natural world seems to me central. Even starting at the beginning, the passage you read, and it gets echoed when you talk about the them coming down, invaders had crossed our border, entering our land as 2 enormous snakes. And a little bit later, which you read, rumors came like crows. Often, the thoughts people have are connected to things in their physical and natural world. And I'm wondering, when you started to think of writing the book, was that in your consciousness? Were you thinking about, how do I put these things together?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think I had a lot of resistance to this actually for many
Did you?
years. Yeah, because
Well, tell us.
because I couldn't physically go to Tibet. I did go to the border and spent 15 minutes on Tibetan soil, which I wrote about for the Kenyan Review. And if you get through the whole book, you'll see how that manifests in the
Yes.
novel itself. But I had to get over my resistance to describing the land and to taking the readers there, and also the very physical experience of exile, especially the early years of refugeehood, which is a very difficult experience. You know, people survived on one bowl of rice a day, and this is not talked about. I think yesterday we had an event in the Tibetan community, and a writer there said, you know, we don't really think of as our refugee experience as being interesting. And I wanted to, like, no, this is very interesting and also important, and we need to capture this. And that is all like day-to-day, bodily, physical experience of a hard life in infertile soil as refugees living in camps and trying to make something grow, you know, and trying to survive in the borders where the wind is like unrelenting. So all of this, you know, personally I had to break down my resistance to getting there because it's a difficult story, but also I had to break down my sort of imposter syndrome, being able to write about this.
You said something to me when you were not sure at the very beginning of what became We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, whether you would write a novel or a collection of stories. What changed for you?
Well, I think you told me very directly to write a novel.
Yeah, I mean, this, you know, the subject is so large. And I want to go back also to your childhood with books. At what point in your own life did it occur to you that you might want to write books?
I don't think it occurred to me until I somehow got to Columbia.
Really?
Yeah, because again, it did not seem possible to me for a long time. Not that it wasn't possible, it just seemed like such a far-fetched idea. I've always loved books, and I did a creative writing undergrad as well as IR, but really I was like, the creative writing is just my like candy, and the IR is the practical thing. You know, as the child of refugees and immigrants and enterprising people trying to survive, like the IR is the real thing that I'm doing, and I'll just take these workshops on the side. And I think once even, you know, before I got to Columbia, I was working as a full-time activist in my community in Toronto, and I was taking night courses in creative writing. And I knew I wanted to write, and I knew I wanted to get back to that space, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna apply. I'm just gonna spend a few years working on my writing, see what happens. It's like I never completely admitted to myself this is what I wanted to do. And once I got to Columbia, you know, I decided this is what I want to do.
And then to go back to the first question, if you can, sketch in for us a little bit of the stages the construction of the book went through during a 10-year period, really.
Yes. The first 4 years, I think I was just, I knew the characters. I knew who was in the story very early because they just kind of came to me. And all I did was cut a few characters out, but I never added new characters. So I focused in on a specific family. But I spent about 4 years just making my characters do things, you know, just like writing pages. Because I was also being workshopped all the time by you and other people, so I was just like, okay, I just gotta produce pages. And then after about 4 years of just producing pages, I finally got to the end of the draft. And at that point, Maza Mengiste was also my mentor, and she told me, you have to get to the end of the draft so you can see what the story is. And once I did, I erased the whole thing and started over. So I began a new document and wrote the novel all over again. And at that point, I also began spending a lot of time in the stacks at Columbia, which has one of the best one of the best collections of Tibetan scholarship in the world. So I was very fortunate to be able to do that. So I spent a lot of time reading about Buddhist metaphysics, Buddhist art, you know, all kinds of things. And I started to enrich the text with the research.
I always remember Columbia professor, just before my generation, Lionel Trilling, remarking that you can learn how to bake a cake from Anna Karenina. But again, in this book, you will find out, you will learn about things, you will learn how the antique market and the faux antique market works. You will find out how all kinds of things were. But to go back to, you knew your characters. To what degree, we essentially have 3 generations of women. To what degree were they invented, if you want to talk about this, and to what degree did you rely and, let's say, steal? Authors we always steal from your own life and from your own family.
I would say that the setting was based on the refugee camp that my parents met at, although I gave it a fictional name just for safety reasons.
Yes.
There's a lot of pressure on Tibetans in Nepal, so I didn't want to give the real name, but if you know, you know. And that's cool. But in terms of the story itself, that was invented, but I did know that I wanted to write about Tibetan women because I have a lot of Tibetan women in my life, and I find them to be incredible people and incredible subjects to study. Also, like, this is not something that gets written about enough, even in my community, which we do have novels and books, but a lot of them focus on men, and a lot of them focus on our leaders, and they don't focus on ordinary Tibetans, which is my experience of this existence.
I thought one of the enchanting things about the book is the degree to which, although because the novel has a kind of epic quality, what happens to them is larger than life. To try to imagine people who are endlessly on the edge of not existing, really, you evoke this, the horror of this very well, but at the same time, we get the ordinary intricacies, jealousies, rivalries, affections within an ordinary family between the mother, the daughter, sisters. It's remarkable. I want to read a little passage near the end of the book, because I want to talk a little bit about, or have Tsering talk about the art of the book, because the book is beautifully written, and near the end, we're dealing, I won't give away any plot, but we're dealing with the death of one of the significant people in the book. And the pyre set out into the water has burned of the body. With the full container in my hands, I walk to the river's edge. The ashes look just like the sand here. What a wonderful way to describe it. I twist the lid off, pour the ashes into the plastic bag, and tie it shut. Then I squat down, dig my fingers into the cool, damp soil, and fill the bronze container. In a numbed daze, I walk to my Jeep, and again, notice the primitive and the modern keep being joined forever. The old, the new, the ancient, with our world. I walk to my Jeep, holding the container of sand in one hand and the plastic bag of warm ashes in the other. A high crackling sound comes from the horizon as a white car appears on the gravel road along the gorge. It's moving too fast for this rough terrain. And then a little bit later, she sees somebody. And then instead of staring at what's happening, we do move down to an emotional moment and a real focus. All at once, tears fell from my eyes, and there's nothing sentimental in the bad sense of that word in this book. She is so plainly Lama's child, so plainly mine. Even Bim must see this, but neither he nor Dolma can know my dizzying bewilderment. And then listen to this. It's as if the earth and sky had traded places. The woman whose body succumbed to flames, whose ashes flew above me just a moment ago, has now returned. So I want to ask you, if you, to the degree that you can, to talk a little bit about the ineffable. What went on when you were typing, when you were editing, to create these passages of gorgeous craft in terms of the turning of sentences?
Oh, that's a really hard question to answer, Jay.
Yeah.
I did many, many strange things to get and a lot of this happens in the editing process, as you know. Like there's a draft, and then the editing is a combing over a text for thousands of times to get somewhere. For instance, I listened obsessively to the same albums for like years. I also listened to poetry over and over again, readings. I listened to Molly Bloom's section of Ulysses over and over again for
The
certain.
last part.
Yes,
Yes
yes,
and
yes, yes, exactly.
Mhm.
All of these things had to do with trying to shake my own sort of inclinations or proclivities towards the language. I tried to continuously make myself see it as a stranger.
And when, and think of it maybe a little bit as music, which I do when I write, I don't know if you do, but when you're composing sentences such as the ones I just read, what is directing you to the cadence and the order of words?
It's sound. It's
Sound,
absolutely
it is
sound.
sound,
It
yeah.
is sound. I have to listen to it over and over. I read it
Yeah,
out loud to
okay.
myself, and but I also have to print it out, look at it as many different ways as I can to try to estrange myself from my own words.
Okay, in the course of, go back to the kind of first question, is there anything, what are the, I'm sure there were some, but what did you learn that surprised you about, well, let's start, about Tibet and the history of your people? And let's just leave it there. What did you learn that you surprised, or what did you discover that you didn't know you would discover?
There were so many discoveries. I think one of the main ones would be the oracular tradition. So, you know, the Neugeboren oracle, which is the state oracle of Tibet, is the Dalai Lama's oracle, is the most famous oracle in Tibetan culture, and he sort of divined the path that the Dalai Lama took into escape and through the Himalayas to safely escape. But this is a much older and much more like common thing, actually. And in Western Tibet, Central Tibet, where my family's from, there were a lot of village oracles, and a lot of these village oracles were women. And these women were often leaders in their communities. They would help people mediate issues. They would often help them heal, like doctors, and they would advise people on really important issues. And this has been happening for thousands of years. And women were often protectors of the land because, you know, the vessels, the gods that they were speaking through, you know, that their voices were speaking through, they lived in the land, in the mountains, in the lakes, and the rivers. And so the land had to be like pure and kept safe and kept clean. And I found it really moving because often I think we think that, you know, progress is linear and that like ancient peoples weren't as wise or whatever. But actually, I found it very moving to think of Tibetan women being leaders in this way for thousands of years, far from the centers of power in their villages, and that's really became sort of the focus of my book, to recast this historical moment that's so important for our society and our culture. Recast it through women, to put women at the center of it, and to focus the entire narrative on the ways in which women hold our communities together.
And what in that discovery, what were the major elements that enabled them to do that, given the fact that there's a sort of powerlessness that's all around them?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that the power gets expressed in all kinds of different ways that might not be legible to some other people, right? So to claim that you were a vessel for a god, then you suddenly have all kinds of authority. And there were women who were literally leading resistance forces in Tibet against the Chinese that claimed to be vessels for like a holy bird from a short story, like from 1,000 years ago. And suddenly they said, I am a bird from that story, and I'm speaking as a god. And suddenly they were leading an army. And so there are so many ways in which people express powers that might not be legible or might not be direct for us or for other people. But I do believe that agency is always there. And I believe that it's expressed in ways that we have to be really careful to look for and to try to understand.
Yeah, and what comes through very strongly in the book is the reality of what we may ordinarily think of as being intangible. It's beautiful. But I want to turn this over to you now and the audience, and let questions or comments for Tsering about her book, about the novel.
How did you find the voice of the book? It's so simple and powerful, and it just seems like it must be very finely crafted. How did you come to it?
How did you come to the basic story, which seems simple, but how did it arrive?
So I've heard a few authors talk about voice, and I think the voice can be sometimes seen as something like innate, like some quality of just like how you think and how you talk. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think voice is the lens that you have as a writer, like what you're willing to be interested in and what you're willing to say, and how wide or narrow your scope is. And for me, that took a long time to understand what my subject matter was and what my positioning was vis-a-vis the subject matter, like this topic, right? So I think Marilyn Robinson said, like, the hardest thing for a writer is to find out what your subject is. And once you do, a new discipline kicks in, a new discipline of like craft and like just like dedication, and all the technical problems get solved when you know what your subject matter is. So that was the search I had to make. Like it was like finding out what my subject matter was. And that came through research and like finding out where the gems were, what really like tickled my fancy, like what I'm really interested in. And once I found those things, I just had to go for it. And that's really where I think the voice emerges. The next book will have a different voice, I think, because it'll be a new set of interests for me.
Yeah, I'm going to say, people often say to people, write what you know, but I think this book is a proof that often it's what you want to know becomes your subject. And I always think there's a wonderful line in Willa Cather's novel, The Song of the Lark, which is, desire is creation. And I think that's, you find your subject, but your subject often is, as the subject of this book often is lost, that you reclaim by conjuring up people in a story. Anyway, other questions? Yes.
I think kind of related to that, when writing about this type of subject matter and doing this kind of research or any research, you usually end up with more questions than you answer. So how did you find, especially because also the project took so long to complete, like how did you feel satisfied with like the borders of a project when like the subject matter and your interest in it is kind of limitless?
Yeah, I had to create artificial constraints for myself. So for instance, like I said initially that I got rid of some characters. So if I could have, I would have written this with 100 characters. Like, very Tolstoy-esque, like just gone for it, like included everybody's just as important, and all these, spent, 4 or 5 pages on just one minor character story. I love that stuff. But for this book, I really decided to focus in on a family. And so that was a really important decision to make that constrained me and helped me, because it could have gotten overwhelming. So having the characters and that sort of narrative constraint, it also narrowed how much research I would do. But I love the expansive books as well. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Well, you must be curious about something.
I thought also the description, especially in the beginning, where I'm at, page 125, life within the refugee camp and the moments of like the time when Tibetans were expelled from their land. So what were the sources? Because it's so visceral and it's so long ago and you weren't there, so.
Yeah, so I think Jay sort of asked, like, what was taken from real life and what was not. So I had multiple different sources. One was little gems of stories that I had been able to glean from my family. It's a difficult thing to ask family members to relive the past. I think it's not something to be taken lightly, right? And so every once in a while I would get a story from a family member, like just a little tiny story. For instance, the story of the man who dies and his body must be transported to the capital, hidden as a living relative, just carried on somebody's back. That actually happened. So because you cannot transport dead bodies, if you don't have a car, you have to get on a public bus and pretend that they're alive on your back. This happened. People died in very difficult circumstances, and even more importantly, their journey through the post-death rituals, which are considered so important in my culture, that had to be done in a state of poverty and like displacement and difficulty. So people had to come up with all kinds of ways to take care of their dead. So that was real, and then so I had little gems like that my family members would give me, and I did not ask for them aggressively, and I used them sparingly. I didn't even use all the stories I had because I do believe that these stories are sacred, and I don't think they should be used just to use them. So many of them I didn't even put in this novel. And then beyond that, I actually went into the archives trying to look at the records of the Red Cross. That's how I found out about a lot of the conditions of the refugee camps. And I also read the Tibetan Oral History Project, which is a series of interviews with elderly Tibetans, and they talk about their past. And so I had to sort of find it in different places. And also there was scholarship, but not a lot of the scholarship focuses on ordinary Tibetans in modern day. They're really quite interested in aristocrats or ancient Tibetan culture. So, which is another issue altogether, right? Like what's valuable, who's interesting, that's another issue. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Tsering, how do you feel like the process of writing this book and seeking this information from family, from your research and from the community, how do you feel like that changed or deepened your relationship with that community of the Tibetan diaspora, or even just within your family?
I kept this book a secret from my family pretty much until recently. So, my mom was always like, why do you keep going to the woods for 2 months every year? I didn't quite understand. So a lot of that I kept secret, but I recently told my sister, she asked, what's the book about? And the book hadn't come out yet. And I said, I'm really interested in the oracular tradition. And my sister, who grew up in the refugee camp, and she was like, we had 3 oracles in our camp. And I saw them heal people in front of my eyes and, suck poison out of a kid's back and save these people. But I forgot about that because of course you would. Now you're living in the West and that all seems like a dream. None of the things we believed in have a place in the world anymore. But she recalled that, and I found that to be so surprising. And I also told my mother, who doesn't read English, a little bit of the story of the book. And when I told her about the ancient ku that this was just statue, would be the wrong translation, statue that appears and disappears to help those in need. At one point she sort of went like this and was sort of praying, and I said, I just made this up though. She said, yes, but it happens. And at that moment I realized that the line between fiction and the real is very, very thin. And that was really a moving moment for me. So that's sort of my family. Broader, I was really afraid, honestly, to publish this book. My dear friends will know how much anxiety I felt because there aren't too many Tibetan novels published. This is only the second in the West, which I don't say proudly. Rather, I think that's indictment of the West. Western publishing, because there are plenty of Tibetan writers that haven't have been working in obscurity and should be published in the West. But you know, I was worried about how my community would respond to this, because I touch on a lot of taboo topics. I touch on, you know, mental health issues, alcoholism, abuse, the theft of antiques, and the ways in which Tibetans were involved in that. And I was worried about that, but actually the community has deeply, deeply embraced this book. I've just done a tour, you know, this is the last stop for me for a little while, and I've been most touched by young Tibetans expressing interest and enthusiasm for the book. So I guess I would just say, like, for all the Tibetans here, like, if you're interested in, you know, producing art or producing culture, like, don't worry, like, you know, we will support you.
Yeah, but when you were talking about the anecdotes from your family, when I was teaching at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian Igbo writer, was there for many years. He escaped. He got out of Nigeria during the Civil War, came there, and he and I would often talk, and our discussions would almost always wind up at this point where we would talk about how our parents, but even more our grandparents and uncles and aunts, would husband their stories. They wouldn't give them to us. And so that's an interesting thing, you know, that would seem to be transnational, that the older generations don't want to pass down tales, and in each culture probably the reasons are different, I would guess, but very interesting. But we treasure the ones we do get.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, other questions, please.
So I have two short questions. First one is, what motivated you to finish the book? And then if you would like to share being an activist, like you said, you were active in the Toronto community. So for like Tibetan women and like queer people who are most visible in organizing spaces, but mostly invisible in leadership positions, like what would your message be for them?
So what motivated me to finish the book is the first question. This was an obsession. You know, I'm a writer. This is like the thing I did every night after I finished my day job. And just like anybody else, like if you find that obsession, it's very hard to let go. And so I literally could not stop. It was compulsive. And I didn't have any reason to believe that I would be successful. I just couldn't stop. And then in terms of a message for Tibetan, you know, like, yeah, like there are many, many voices that get subsumed under a national narrative in our community, and you know, for understandable reasons, because we have a struggle that we're fighting a much greater power, and so all of our messaging, you know, all of the narrative is all about our resistance and our freedom struggle. But I think that's like unfortunate that we might think that we can only have one narrative, and I think that's wrong. And especially for fighting for something, or fighting for liberation or freedom, well, what does that freedom look like? Does that freedom look like a single narrative that emerges victorious? I hope not. I hope we don't have a free Tibet in which only one narrative survives. I hope we have a free Tibet in which this is the opposite of what authoritarianism looks like in China and Tibet right now. A world in which we have a proliferation of narratives, an equality and an unhierarchical world in which everybody's story matters. And so I think we have to push against that, not only externally, outside our communities, but internally. And we're trying to build a vision for what freedom looks like, what liberation looks like. And that work has to happen inside of our community as well.
Okay. What else are you curious about? You said you are at work on a new novel?
Yeah.
You want to talk about it before you write it?
I can. I mean, you know, but I don't, like, I'm not holding myself to it, you know.
Okay. That's good. Yeah, just curious, where is it set?
It's set along the Silk Road, so in Central Asia, near Tibet. Basically, it's based on, the inspiration is, there's a passage early in my book where the Oracle Mother is on the border region, and she refuses to do premonitions. She refuses to do healings and put on her oracular garb and to do that duty. And somebody in her camp says, oh, but you can fly across the sky, you can ride on the backs of tigers, you have superhuman strength, how can you not help us in this time of need? And so I want to write the next novel in a world in which all of the things that that person said were true actually are true, and to write about a world in which all the things we believed in before colonization are treated as real, and to have a world in which, yeah, really questioning reality itself, to go into a more supernatural Tibetan perspective of magical creatures. So I've been doing a lot of image meditation, in detailed images from Tibetan paintings of these like strange, beautiful creatures, deities, and trying to find the human in the gods. Essentially trying to do character studies of these characters and say, who are you? What's your story? And building a cast and a world around that. So that's where I am. It's very, very early stages. I'm doing research, but the essential obsession is the same. It's about empire. It's about collapse. It's about if there's a love story. You know, all the good stuff that I'm.
Yeah, there is a love story.
Yeah, there's actually one of my young cousins who's like 13. She read the whole book in a few days, and she only cared about the love story. She recounted in perfect detail to me. She found the rest of it very boring.
Well, good. Yeah.
I have a question.
Oh, no, so I think, anything else you're?
Could I ask a question real quick?
Oh, you do, yes, please.
Hi, Tashda, first of all, thank you so much for writing this very powerful, moving, and such a deeply personal story. I'm sure every Tibetan who reads this book will find their lineage, their ancestors, their family story somewhere in there, so thank you so much. And in those lines, and because it is such a personal story, even though it's not a lived experience through generations through family, it is very personal. So I'm just wondering how as a writer did you handle that when something is so deeply personal, and does that ever take, I mean, I'm sure it must have taken like some sort of emotional toll as well, and how do you navigate that?
Mm-hmm. It definitely took an emotional toll. And I said I had to fight a lot of my own resistance. And that was the really hard part, is like letting myself go to these places. But I also, I approached it gently. I approached the topic gently. I approached all these stories gently with a recognition for how they might impact Tibetan readers. So everything has to be justified. I made my characters suffer a great deal. I'm the writer, so I'm making my characters suffer. But I really like the way Nabokov talks about this. He says that there is an ethical dimension in making, as a writer, to make your characters suffer. You don't just make them suffer to make them suffer. You have to give their suffering meaning. Mm-hmm. And so that was always the struggle. It's like, how do I give their suffering meaning? And that was the thing that I had to achieve. And always trying to find a way to, to land each character in a point of meaning. And if I could do that, then I felt it was worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And you think it was?
Yes.
Good.
You taught me.
We agree.
I read through 1/3, and I think it was. Yeah.
We agree. What else are you curious about? Yes.
Hi. So you spoke earlier about these processes that you had for trying to estrange yourself from your own words so that you could be a better editor of your own words. But you've also spoken about, this is a deep and personal session. I'm wondering, was it difficult balancing those two and moving back and forth between them in the process of writing the story?
Yes. And that's why this is not a work of like pure catharsis. Like if this was a work of pure catharsis, I would just like write whatever I wanted. But I'm trying to communicate to a reader something that I think might be worth their time. And so I always have to like zoom in and zoom out. Like this is the move. And one way of thinking about this is like I'm trying to draw my readers in with a natural fascination that they might have with the story. There has been long-standing fascination with Tibet. Often that leads to exoticizing and ultimately dehumanizing narratives about Tibet as like savage or barbarians or like innately peaceful, compassionate beings who, just like don't suffer. So like there is all this like fascination with Tibet, which is, along the lines of Orientalism and the ways in which the East looks at it's, about the empire more than anything else. And then at the same time, every time I bring the reader in, I'm trying to subvert their expectations. So those are two moves I'm trying to make in this book throughout the thing. I'm trying to bring the reader in. I know you might be interested in this, but let me give you something that you're actually not expecting. And so that requires me to push deeply into the subject matter, and also to zoom out and say, like, what is ultimately meaningful about this topic? Not just for me, but more broadly, right? Like, this is a story of displacement, which 70 million people experience alive today. This is a story of refugeehood and immigration and marginalization. Poverty is a big topic in this topic. So I'm thinking about all of these bigger topics while also forcing myself to dig deep into the. There's a lot of push and pull, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yes.
I think I'm gonna come back up. Just wanna thank you for this conversation, and thank you all for really, really wonderful, generative questions. Again, so excited to have so many of you here. I do just want to give folks a heads up. There are a few more of you than we expected, so we've actually already sold out of books. We've got a bunch on order that are going to be here later in the week, so we'll be taking names if you want to reserve one of those copies at the desk. If you do have your hands on a copy, Tsering's going to be signing at that back desk. If you're still with us on YouTube, feel free to purchase a copy with the link in the live stream, and let's give these two one more round of applause.